The 2019 film Danger Close tells the story of Delta Company, 6th Royal Australian Regiment at the Battle of Long Tan, Australia's biggest engagement in the Vietnam War. The purpose of this video is not only to review the film, but to take a step further to dissect the film and compare it to the real events that took place at Long Tan. After watching the film, I was so interested in learning the real story and the real characters, and this video is largely a product of that research. There will absolutely be spoilers, so if you haven't seen it, I recommend watching first and then coming back here when you're looking to learn more. This is a closer look at Danger Close, the Battle of Long Tan.
I was only 19. From Bungtow riding Chinooks to the dust at Newey Dat, I'd been in and out of choppers now for months. And we made our tents a home, VB and pin-ups on the lockers, and an Asian orange sunset through the scrub. And can you tell me, doctor, why I still can't get to sleep?
A Vietnam veteran from southern Queensland has been finally recognised for his outstanding bravery in the Battle of Long Tan.
It comes and goes, can you tell me what it means? God help me. I was only 19.
When I was a young man, I carried me pack, and I lived the free life of the rover.
I was genuinely excited when I first heard about Danger Close because it's one of the only modern war films to tackle Australia's role in Vietnam. For decades, big film and TV productions have mostly returned to Gallipoli, an undeniably defining sacrifice that still dominates Australia's war memory. But that focus also meant that Vietnam, and the Australians who fought there, have often been pushed to the margins, and this film felt like a rare chance to bring that forgotten chapter back into the spotlight. Major Harry Smith, played by Travis Fimmel, wrote in his book that Long Tan turned into a lifelong battle of fighting with higher-ranking officers for proper rewards and recognition for his men. This dichotomy of the brass and the grunts clashing is central to the story and beautifully depicted in the film. In this sense, Danger Close is also in conversation with earlier Australian war stories on screen, especially Gallipoli. If you've seen the 2015 Gallipoli miniseries, you will notice a small repertoire of actors turning up again in Danger Close. Anthony Hayes, Travis Jeffrey, Sam Parsonson, and Lincoln Lewis among them. That casting overlap subtly ties Long Tan back into the Anzac mythos, visually suggesting that these are the descendants, spiritual if not literal, of the boys at the Dardanelles. But the deeper connection is there for the taking. Once again, young Aussies are overseas fighting and dying in someone else's war, either dragged in by Britain or the United States, and their jobs are made considerably more difficult by incompetent leadership and poor decision-making. The story is then driven by how these kids deal with the deadly consequences of these decisions. And in true spirit of the Anzacs, the Australians at Long Tan are outnumbered nearly 20-1 by a determined enemy defending their homeland. You just get the sense that these kids have no business being in battle, and that the brass have no business leading them. And that is the archetypal Aussie war story. And while Australia didn't lose nearly as many men in Vietnam as the United States, you still feel as if they somehow got the short end of the stick. This raises a question that you might have already wondered: how exactly did Australians end up in Vietnam? With the post-World War II rise of communist governments in the 50s and 60s, and as fear of communism spread throughout the West, Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies concluded that due to Australia's precarious geographic location in Southeast Asia, close to China, a communist victory in South Vietnam would be a direct military threat to national security. To quote an article by Peter Edwards, as a young man of military age during World War I and as a youthful prime minister at the outbreak of World War II, Menzies knew how painful it was for Britain and its dominions to be at war without America. The crucial step, it seemed, was to ensure American commitment. Australia's forward defense strategy after 1945 was to make small but effective military commitments in order to keep both Britain and the United States, which Menzies called our great and powerful friends, committed to Southeast Asia. So effectively, the goal was to make it seem like the Australians were somewhat involved in the conflict, but not too involved. So in 1965, when American officials requested an increased presence of Australian military advisors, Menzies decided to send a battalion of 800 men. A year later, In early 1966, the 6th RAR received orders to deploy to Vietnam as part of an expansion of Australia's forces. They arrived in Vietnam on June 9th, and after a brief stint at the base in Vung Tau, the 6th RAR was then flown into Nui Dat at the Phuoc Thi province in South Vietnam. The film does a strong job of compressing the chain of events that led to the battle into a clear, dramatic opening act. It begins the night before with a mortar barrage on Nui Dat. Some soldiers are scrambling for their lives, while others, like Gordon Sharp, are more focused on poker than on incoming rounds. It's a bit hokey for my liking, but again, it reinforces the sense that these are just kids being watched by adults, like Sergeant Bob Buick and Major Harry Smith. We're also introduced to one of the film's main characters, Private Paul Large, played by Daniel Weber. He's drinking on perimeter watch and accidentally discharges his rifle, and then lies about the incident to Smith, who sees right through it. It's a scene that sets up the dynamic between the two characters, but as we'll see later, it's also where Danger Close starts quietly reshaping who the real Paul Large actually was. But hold that thought. Historically, that bombardment did trigger a series of patrols. The next morning, Lieutenant Colonel Colin Townsend sent out companies to search for the firing positions and find signs of the enemy. And Bravo Company did in fact locate some mortar sites without making major contact. Later that morning, Delta was ordered to relieve them and to continue the sweep out towards the Long Tan rubber plantation. The timing of this happening during the Little Patty and Cole Joy concert is indeed true to real-life events, and the men were disheartened to learn that they would be missing the concert for a patrol. It's suggested that Delta Company drew the short end of the stick due to Smith's strained relationship with Townsend, who believed he was sending them on an errant patrol to wander through the jungle while he and the officers could kick back and enjoy the concert. This tendency to underestimate the enemy in both size and skill is a classic blunder in Western entanglements with guerrilla forces, and Vietnam is no exception. From the very first major engagement of the war at the Ai Drang to Tet and Hue City, American units continually found themselves surprised and outnumbered by well-equipped NVA regulars. Long Tan fits that pattern perfectly. When Delta Company set off, they thought they were chasing a small contact, maybe a mortar harassing party or perhaps a local VC company. But instead, they collided with a combined force of over 2,000 regulars from the D-445th Battalion. The film emphasizes this misreading of the situation, and it links that directly to arrogance and neglect at the task force level. In particular, Brigadier General Oliver Jackson's reluctance to believe that the enemy would risk attacking Nui Dat. In real life, there was genuine debate in headquarters about the scale of the threat and whether the mortar attack signaled a larger operation, and intelligence officers and some field commanders worried that a major force was moving near the base, while others believed that the enemy was unlikely to press an attack on a well-defended Australian position. The film perhaps oversimplifies this into a good officer versus bad officer setup, but it does capture the broader truth that senior leaders misjudged just how many enemy troops were out there, and the grunts would pay the price for that miscalculation. At 3:15 p.m. on August 18th, moving in a triangle formation to the east, Delta Company enters the rubber plantation at Long Tan. 20 minutes later, 11 Platoon would initiate contact with the enemy at a track crossing in the plantation. The inexperienced Lieutenant Gordon Sharp makes the fateful decision to pursue the enemy force. This brings to mind a nearly identical tactical mistake that was made at the start of the Battle of the Ai Drang, when a young Lieutenant Henry Herrick orders his platoon to chase a lone Viet Cong soldier through the valley and straight into an ambush. At 4:08 p.m., 11 walks directly into a major enemy force with at least 2 machine guns. The left-hand section gets hit very hard and 2 Australians are killed instantly. From here, the platoon is pinned down and continues taking casualties. So you have 11th Platoon cut off from the main force in a very bad situation, and now the rest of the engagement will revolve around trying to rescue and recover this lost platoon. At 4:27, Smith orders 10 Platoon to try to get through to 11th. From here, the battle becomes a grind of movement, contact, and artillery. Almost hour by hour, the film tracks what really happened on the ground. Now, rather than narrating every beat, I want to highlight 3 things that matter for understanding both the battle and the movie: how it handles tactics and terrain, how it frames the grunts versus the leadership, and just how far it's willing to bend the truth for drama. On the tactical side, Danger Close is often at its best. You really get a sense of what it means to fight in that rubber plantation. Long, straight rows that give you lines of sight but not much cover, the rain closing visibility down, and the company slowly contracting from a patrol formation into something closer to a defensive box as they are pushed into a tighter perimeter while enemy forces close in from multiple directions. You really feel that shift from "we're chasing a small contact" to "we're hanging on and trying not to be overrun." And one of the reasons this is a very real threat is the ammo situation. Each soldier's standard combat load was surprisingly light. They only carried 2 spare SLR magazines plus 1 in the rifle. So that meant each man only carried 60 loaded rounds, which, if you're outnumbered 20 to 1, you're going to go through pretty quick. And resupply was another issue, as supplied rounds were in boxes rather than preloaded magazines, which meant that soldiers had to pack mags in the middle of a firefight. Now, let's talk a little bit about the artillery. The film, per its name, really does make an effort to highlight the critical role of the guns in turning the tide of the battle. You see the forward observer, Maury Stanley, constantly on the radio, bringing rounds in closer and closer until they're landing, well, danger close. Because keeping these fire missions going nonstop is exactly how the battle was decided. And the lack of cover in the rubber plantation actually meant that the artillery had a devastating effect against the enemy who was moving around in the open. But we'll come back to this in a big way later, because even as the film respects the artillery, it does not really respect the man on the radio behind it. But hold that thought. Now, let's talk about Major Harry Smith. He sits in a difficult space between the grunts and the higher command, and the film really leans into that in-between role. He's framed as a lonely professional soldier who drills his company relentlessly, but we will eventually see that this is rooted in a greater desire to keep them safe. This line in the film,
"And no coughing or farting before breakfast,"
is actually a real standard to which Smith was known to hold his men. So his men resent his toughness, and the gentrified officers look down on his lack of war college credentials. Where the film turns that into drama is in how it openly pits Smith against Lieutenant Colonel Townsend and Brigadier General Jackson. A lot of the middle act is structured around him begging for reinforcements, pushing for permission to bring artillery in closer, and arguing against any suggestion of pulling back while one of his platoons is still missing. On screen, this becomes a very clear men in the field versus men at the map table conflict. Smith is dirty, angry, focused on survival. The higher command are dry, composed, and more worried about the security of Nui Dat than the company that's actually in contact. You can also see how this plays straight into that archetypal Aussie war story I talked about earlier. Once again, it's the frontline soldiers who are portrayed as realistic and adaptable, while the graduates and career staff officers come across as blinkered or slow to accept how bad things are. The movie doesn't quite make Jackson or Townsend outright villains, but it clearly wants you to feel that their caution and misreading of the threat leaves D Company exposed longer than it should be and gets men killed. Now that fits Harry Smith's own long-running bitterness about how the battle was assessed and how his men were, or weren't, recognized afterwards. And the film basically compresses decades of that resentment into a handful of heated exchanges. For me, this is one of those places where Danger Close is walking a fine line. On one hand, giving Smith that push-pull with his superiors makes him a more compelling character and helps viewers understand just how alone D Company felt out in that plantation. On the other hand, it does flatten some of the nuance around command. Things like genuine uncertainty about enemy numbers, the risk of committing the reserve too early, or the nightmare scenario of Nui Dat itself coming under attack. The film keeps the broad truth that senior leaders underestimated the scale of the threat and that the men on the ground paid the price, but it just delivers that truth in a very streamlined way. One good officer fighting for his company against a system that doesn't really want to listen. Now, I totally get that a film needs to compress and dramatize for the sake of simplicity and keeping the audience engaged. Every war film does it. But the way Danger Close does it tells you something specific about what kind of movie it wants to be. And the clearest way to see that choice is to look at how it handles 2 real men in Delta Company. One of them, Private Paul Large, gets a fictional redemption arc that the historical record doesn't really support. The other, Captain Maury Stanley, is technically present and even gets one of the film's most iconic lines, but he's never really developed as a person. And given what he actually did that day, that's a striking gap. Once you see those 2 choices side by side, you see exactly where the film picks story over realism, and the producers have actually been pretty open about why. Daniel Weber's Paul Large is the screw-up who gets annealed by combat. He's introduced drinking on sentry duty, accidentally discharges his rifle, lying to Smith about it, and then, over the course of the battle, slowly redeems himself until he becomes the kind of soldier that Smith respects. There's even a moment where Large somehow finds a way through to 11 platoon, as if no one else in the company had any idea where their own missing men were. And Smith reacts to it like it's a fucking miracle. It's a clean, satisfying, dramatic arc, but it's also entirely invented, and producer Martin Walsh even said as much on camera. In an interview with ABC News in 2019, sitting next to Paul's 2 sisters, Walsh said outright that they really needed a character to anchor the film and someone who could encapsulate all of the values and provide a focus throughout, and that the relationship between Large and Smith was the other half of that hook. So Paul Large, the character, was, by the producer's own admission, partly engineered as a vehicle for the audience's emotional investment in Smith. The real Paul Large was a country kid from Kula, New South Wales. He was the only brother to 5 sisters and raised shooting rabbits and kangaroos. His childhood mate wrote that Largy was the instigator, the loudest voice in the room, the kind of kid no one really had a memory of with a serious face. After basic training, Paul came home and announced to his mates, quote, "Those bastards can't shoot," and he couldn't wait to get on a rifle range to show them how. That's the Paul Large the veterans actually remember, a confident, mouthy, country-bred shooter, not a clueless screw-up. His national service number came up in the 1965 ballot, and he was posted to 12 Platoon, Delta Company 6 RAR. In a letter home from Canungra in April 1966, he proudly told his parents that the CO had just announced that D Company was the best company and 12 Platoon the best platoon that had been through the training center since World War II. He told his mother that the battalion's march through Brisbane in May was the single proudest moment of his life. Then, on June 6th, his 21st birthday, he shipped out to Vietnam. And once in country, Largy had a bit of a disciplinary record that the film sort of alludes to. He fronted Major Smith on charges 3 separate times, and just 2 days before Longtan, he punched a lance corporal who mouthed off to him. Smith was about to give him 21 days of field punishment, but Largy demanded a court-martial instead and had 4 witnesses ready to testify that it was self-defense. And according to the surviving veterans, his mates were absolutely prepared to lie for him. Smith dismissed the charges. So that whole pattern of Largy's disciplinary record and his cocky attitude, these things are real. The film just compresses them into a few invented scenes to make the point. They just took it a bit too far, especially with the whole scene of Largy somehow finding a way through to 11. I mean, to me, this whole scene just seemed ridiculous and unnecessary. But they did this because they wanted Largy's character to have a redemption arc and for him to give some humanity back to Smith. And this is really where you can see Hollywood somehow felt the need to over-dramatize the real events for some strange fear that Smith would come across as lacking humanity. I mean, the real Major Smith would then dedicate the rest of his life to ensuring his men receive proper recognition for their actions in the battle. I don't think they needed to invent a through line to show how much he cared about his men. And Paul Large never needed to earn Smith's respect mid-battle. He was a competent soldier in a platoon that was officially one of the best since World War II. Of the 18 Australians killed at Longtan, Paul Large was the last. The film stages his death close to how it really happened, but it never tells you that. He was 21, he'd been in country for 10 weeks, he's buried in Kula, where they still read his name out every Anzac Day. Let's talk about the underdeveloped hero of the film, Captain Maury Stanley. He's right next to Smith in the command group throughout the battle, and the film actually gives him one of its biggest dramatic moments. So it's not accurate to say that Stanley is invisible. He's there, he's effective, and he gets a hero beat. But what the film doesn't do is let you on who he actually was, or how he was essentially the deciding factor in the battle. He's a function before he's a person. We don't learn where he's from, we don't get a real sense that he's the only New Zealand officer in a predominantly Australian command group, and we don't get any biographical anchor that would let a casual viewer walk out of the cinema and remember his name. Compare that to the runway the film builds for Paul Large. Name, hometown, mates, scenes with his platoon, a clear arc. And the asymmetry is the point. One man is engineered into the emotional center of the film, the other is doing his job in the background. And the job he was doing was extraordinary. Stanley was a New Zealand artillery captain attached to D Company as the forward artillery observer. While Smith maneuvered the company during the battle, Stanley lay in the mud beside him with a sodden, folded map and a radio handset, and over the next 3.5 hours, he personally directed more than 61 fire missions and corrections from 24 guns. And for most of the battle, those guns were firing 8 rounds per minute, which is essentially non-stop. By the end, more than 3,500 rounds had landed in support of Delta Company, and he was doing this blind. The rain was so heavy that he couldn't see where the rounds were falling, his map was disintegrating in his hands, and his radio operator had to keep reminding him to pick up his rifle because Stanley just kept leaving it in the water beside him as he had a much bigger job to do. At critical moments, he was bringing rounds into within 30 meters of his own infantry, and that's obviously where the film's title comes from, Danger Close. The command at Nui Dat refused at one point because they thought it was unsafe. That's the moment that produces the famous radio line in the movie. He also disregarded a request from Sergeant Bob Buick to drop fire directly on Buick's own position. Buick was prepared to be killed by his own artillery rather than be overrun. Stanley, however, refused and kept Buick's platoon alive by other means. In Stanley's own words, his struggle that afternoon wasn't fear. It was, quote, "I had to overcome my own dread that I would make a mistake." And here's the part that lands for me. Harry Smith said it himself on camera in 2010. "I have said it to others. I wouldn't be talking to you now if it hadn't been for Maury Stanley and his guns." That same year, in an unprecedented move, both the Australian and New Zealand governments fast-tracked the Australian unit citation for gallantry to Stanley and his radio operator, Willie Walker. Stanley was the first New Zealander to ever receive this award. He was terminally ill with cancer, and he died 4 months later. The whole reason the ceremony was rushed was so that they could pin it on him in person, in front of Smith, Buick, and Sabin, before he was gone. So I want to be precise about the criticism. Danger Close doesn't downplay what Stanley does on screen. I mean, it actually treats the artillery with more respect than most war films would. What it doesn't do is treat Stanley as a character with anything close to the depth it gives Paul Large. The audience walks away knowing his hometown, his personality, and even his fiance's name. But they walk away with none of that for Captain Maury Stanley. Given that Smith and surviving veterans credit Stanley with their lives, that's a meaningful gap. Once you put those two stories side by side, the shape of the film becomes clear. The producers needed a single emotional anchor, and they chose to build one, partly out of Paul Large, partly out of pure invention, and that's a defensible decision for a 2-hour film aimed at a general audience. But it does come with a cost, because the man who genuinely saved Delta Company is never portrayed as a real person or hero. You can see this as well with the cliche last-second APC rescue, which certainly provides a climactic ending, but leaves you with the impression that the company was just seconds away from certain death. In reality, Stanley's relentless artillery had already gone a long way in breaking the enemy's momentum. The APCs and reinforcements were vital, but they were part of a longer rescue effort, not a single miraculous save. Veterans have been pretty public about pushing back on that rescue framing. None of this ruins the film, but it does show you where Danger Close chooses story over realism. It stays impressively faithful to timeline, the terrain, and the basic order of events, yet it still can't resist some of those stereotypical war film moments. For me, the choices are a mixed bag. They make the film more immediately gripping for an audience that doesn't know anything about Long Tan, but they also risk obscuring what's actually most remarkable about the real battle. That it was won not by a single heroic gesture or miraculous rescue, but by a long series of unglamorous decisions and through ordinary soldiers, and one extraordinary New Zealander on the radio, holding on under immense circumstances. The film's final stretch and epilogue only hint at what came after Long Tan. Harry Smith called his book The Start of a Lifelong Battle for a reason. A big part of his post-war life was spent fighting for proper recognition for his men and pushing back against senior officers' attempt to downplay the size of the enemy force and the scale of what Delta Company had done. After the battle, 9 of Smith's men received gallantry awards, but many of those had been quietly downgraded from the original recommendations, including Smith himself. He was nominated for a Distinguished Service Order and instead received the Lower Military Cross. For decades, he wrote submissions, fronted inquiries, and hassled defense and politicians to fix what he saw as the distortion of the record and an injustice to the soldiers who had actually been there. That lifelong battle eventually did pay off. In 2008, his own award was upgraded to the Star of Gallantry, and several of his men finally had their decorations brought back in line with the original citations, albeit almost half a century after the fact. That's where Danger Close slots back into the broader Aussie war story. For decades, Vietnam, and Long Tan in particular, sat in a quieter, more uncomfortable corner of national memory. For whatever its flaws, this film drags that story into the spotlight and treats those veterans with the seriousness they haven't always been given. In that sense, Danger Close isn't just an action movie about a battle, it's another chapter in how Australia chooses to remember its wars. Who gets to be the hero, who gets forgotten, and how much room there is for doubt and frustration, along courage and brotherhood. As a piece of cinema, I think it's uneven but impressive, especially in the way it stages the battle and respects the technical realities of combat. As a piece of remembrance, it's even more important. It doesn't settle every historical argument about Long Tan, and it leans into a few comforting myths, but it also brings a neglected story back into conversation and invites people to go and find out more. If you're looking for a perfectly faithful historical record, you'll still need books, interviews, and documentaries, but as a gateway into the real story of Long Tan, and as a modern entry into the Aussie war story, Danger Close is a lot better and more honest than most films that just slap based on a true story on its poster. And if nothing else, it proves that when a war film is as honest and authentic as it can be, it hits you in a way that glossy Hollywood shoot-'em-ups just can't. For Harry Smith, the fight to make sure Australia remembered Long Tan properly took the rest of his life. And this film, for all its compressions and inventions, feels like one of the last pieces of that puzzle. Thanks for watching.
I left my heart to the sappers round K-San, and my soul was sold with my cigarettes to the black market man. I had the Vietnam cold turkey from the ocean to the Silver City, and it's only other vets could understand.